The courtroom fell silent. Karen Richardson stood before Judge Judy with a smile that would haunt millions of viewers. Her designer suit pressed to perfection, her blonde highlights catching the studio lights just right, and her leather portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield of invincibility. Then she said the 5 words that would destroy her life forever. "You can't touch me, Judge." The words hung in the air like poison, and what happened next became the most replayed courtroom moment in internet history, shared over 30 million times in just 48 hours. But what Karen didn't know as she stood there with that smug smile plastered across her face was that Judge Judy had spent the previous night uncovering secrets that would expose her lies, her crimes, and her pattern of predatory behavior on national television in front of millions of witnesses. Before we reveal Judge Judy's legendary response that went viral across every social media platform imaginable, make sure you hit that like button if you're ready to see the ultimate entitled Karen get absolutely demolished by America's toughest judge. And don't forget to subscribe because what you're about to witness isn't just another courtroom dispute. This is the moment when a career criminal who thought she was untouchable discovered that arrogance always comes with a price, and that price was about to be paid in the most public, most humiliating way possible. Trust me, you've never seen anything like this before. This wasn't just another HOA dispute or parking lot argument that fills the typical Judge Judy docket. This was about a woman who had been systematically exploiting the most vulnerable members of society for years, believing that her wealth, her connections, and her attorney husband made her completely immune to consequences. Karen Richardson had perfected the art of the long con, targeting elderly homeowners who trusted her fake consulting business, stealing their life savings with a smile, and then disappearing before they even realized they'd been scammed. She had done this not once, not twice, but at least 12 times that investigators knew about, accumulating over $200,000 in stolen money from seniors who could least afford to lose it. Karen thought walking into Judge Judy's courtroom would be just another performance, another chance to use her polished professionalism and legal jargon to confuse and intimidate her victim into silence. She had talked her way out of trouble dozens of times before, always managing to make herself appear like a reasonable businesswoman and her victims like confused, elderly people who simply didn't understand how the world worked. Her husband, a successful attorney at a prestigious law firm, had always been there to clean up her messes, sending threatening letters to anyone who dared complain, making problems disappear with the wave of expensive legal stationery. She had operated in the gray areas of the law for so long that she genuinely believed she had found the perfect crime, a way to steal from people who were too embarrassed, too confused, or too intimidated to fight back. But Judge Judy Scanlon had built her legendary reputation on one unshakable principle that had terrified con artists and manipulators for over 25 years. She didn't care about your polish, your professionalism, or your expensive attorney husband. She cared about truth, evidence, and holding predators accountable for the pain they caused. And Karen Richardson was about to discover that her carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to be ripped apart on national television, piece by piece, lie by lie, scam by scam. Judge Judy had been setting a trap from the moment she reviewed the case file, and Karen had walked right into it with the kind of arrogant confidence that only comes from years of getting away with crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. To understand the magnitude of Karen Richardson's cruelty, you need to meet Margaret Chen, the 73-year-old widow sitting in the plaintiff's chair with trembling hands and eyes red from sleepless nights. Margaret had been a school teacher for 42 years, dedicating her life to educating children in her local elementary school, touching thousands of young lives with patience and kindness. She had married her high school sweetheart Thomas, and together they had built a modest but comfortable life, saving every penny they could to buy their dream home in a quiet neighborhood where they planned to spend their golden years together. But 2 years ago, Thomas died suddenly from a heart attack, leaving Margaret alone in that house filled with memories, living on a fixed income from her teacher's pension and Social Security that barely covered her monthly expenses. When a severe storm damaged Margaret's roof last spring, she was devastated. Water was leaking into her bedroom, ruining the ceiling, threatening to destroy the home she and Thomas had worked so hard to buy. She didn't understand insurance claims or contractor negotiations. She had always relied on Thomas to handle those complicated matters, and now she was alone, scared, and completely overwhelmed by the technical language and endless paperwork that home repairs seemed to require. That's when Karen Richardson appeared like an angel of mercy, or so Margaret thought at the time. Karen had knocked on her door with a warm smile, a professional business card, and an offer that seemed too good to be true. A free consultation to help seniors navigate the complex world of insurance claims and home repairs. Karen told Margaret that elderly homeowners were often taken advantage of by dishonest contractors, and that her consulting business existed specifically to protect vulnerable seniors from scams. The irony of that statement would become painfully clear soon enough. Karen's performance during that first meeting was masterful. She sat in Margaret's living room, looking at photos of Thomas, expressing sympathy for her loss, and explaining in patient, caring tones how overwhelming the home repair process could be for someone in Margaret's situation. She used just enough technical jargon to sound knowledgeable, but not so much that Margaret felt stupid for not understanding. She promised to handle everything: the insurance claim, finding reputable contractors, negotiating fair prices, obtaining the necessary permits, and ensuring the work was done properly. All Margaret had to do was sign a consulting agreement and pay an administration fee of $8,000 to cover Karen's services, paperwork processing, and coordination costs. Karen assured her this was standard industry practice, that the fee would actually save Margaret money in the long run by preventing contractor overcharges and insurance company denials. Margaret hesitated. $8,000 was nearly half of her remaining savings, money she had earmarked for emergencies and helping her grandchildren with college expenses. But Karen was persuasive, explaining that without proper representation, Margaret's insurance claim would likely be denied, and she would end up paying far more than $8,000 out of pocket for roof repairs. Karen showed her official-looking documents, contracts with impressive legal language, and testimonials from other satisfied clients. She even offered to let Margaret think about it overnight, a calculated move that made her seem less pushy, more trustworthy. Margaret, desperate to fix her leaking roof and terrified of being scammed by contractors, signed the contract the next day and wrote Karen a check for $8,000, believing she was protecting herself from dishonest people. She had no idea she was handing her life savings directly to the most dishonest person she would ever meet. For the first 2 weeks, Karen maintained the illusion perfectly. She called Margaret with updates about the insurance claim being filed, about contractors being interviewed, about permits being submitted. She used phrases like "moving through the system" and "waiting for approval" that sounded official enough to be believable. She even sent Margaret official-looking documents, forms that appeared to be insurance paperwork and contractor estimates, all carefully designed to look legitimate while being completely worthless. Margaret felt relieved, believing her roof would soon be repaired and her home would be safe again. But as weeks turned into months, Karen's calls became less frequent. Her updates became more vague. When Margaret asked specific questions about when the work would begin, Karen became irritated, suggesting that Margaret didn't understand how long these processes took, that her constant questions were actually slowing things down. By month 3, Margaret's calls were going straight to voicemail. Her emails went unanswered. The office address on Karen's business card turned out to be a virtual mailbox service. Margaret's roof was still leaking, now worse than before because the damage had spread during the delay. Her $8,000 was gone. The insurance company had no record of any claim being filed on her behalf. The contractors Karen had supposedly hired had never heard of Margaret Chen or Karen Richardson's consulting business. Margaret had been completely, thoroughly, devastatingly scammed by a woman who had looked her in the eyes, sat in her living room, and promised to protect her from the very crime Karen was actively committing. The emotional devastation that followed the scam nearly destroyed Margaret Chen completely. She spent weeks unable to sleep, lying awake at night listening to rainwater drip into buckets scattered around her bedroom, feeling like the biggest fool in the world. How could she have been so stupid? How could she have trusted someone so completely? The shame was almost worse than the financial loss. She couldn't bring herself to tell her children at first, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes when they learned their mother had given away half her savings to a con artist. When she finally confessed what had happened, her daughter Susan immediately wanted to call the police, to hire a lawyer, to fight back against the woman who had stolen from her mother. But Margaret's son David, always the practical one, pointed out what Margaret already feared. The police would call it a civil matter. A lawyer would cost more money they didn't have. Karen Richardson's attorney husband would bury them in legal threats and paperwork. It seemed hopeless. Margaret did eventually file a police report, her hands shaking as she tried to explain to the board desk officer how she had been scammed. The officer was sympathetic but clear. This wasn't a criminal matter in their eyes. It was a contract dispute. Margaret would need to pursue civil court if she wanted her money back. But civil court required filing fees, legal representation, and the kind of knowledge about the legal system that Margaret simply didn't possess. When she tried to find an attorney willing to take her case, they all said the same thing. Sure, they could help, but their retainer fees started at $5,000, and there was no guarantee of winning or recovering the money even if they did win. Margaret was trapped in the perfect crime, too poor to fight back, too embarrassed to make noise about it, too exhausted to keep pushing against a system that seemed designed to protect people like Karen Richardson. Then one night, as Margaret sat in her living room watching television with buckets catching the latest rainfall, she saw an advertisement for Judge Judy. She had watched the show occasionally over the years, always finding satisfaction in seeing entitled people face consequences for their bad behavior. Something clicked in her mind. Judge Judy didn't require lawyer fees. Judge Judy didn't care about fancy legal maneuvers. Judge Judy cared about right and wrong, about evidence and truth. Margaret knew it was a long shot. Thousands of people probably applied to appear on the show. But she had nothing left to lose except her dignity, and Karen Richardson had already stolen most of that along with her money. Margaret's daughter helped her fill out the application online, explaining the scam in careful detail, attaching copies of the fake contract, the worthless documents Karen had provided, and her bank statement showing the $8,000 check. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a call from a producer who said Judge Judy herself had reviewed the case and wanted to hear it in her courtroom. The day of the taping, Margaret arrived at the studio feeling like she might throw up from anxiety. She had never been on television before. She had never confronted anyone in such a public way. Part of her wanted to turn around and go home, to just accept her loss and try to move on with her life. But then she thought about Thomas, about how hard he had worked to buy that house, about how disappointed he would be if she let someone steal from them without fighting back. She thought about the other elderly people Karen had probably scammed, victims who were too scared or too ashamed to come forward. She thought about her grandchildren asking why the roof still leaked months after Grandma had paid someone to fix it. Margaret walked into that courtroom determined to tell her truth, even if her voice shook, even if she cried, even if Karen Richardson sat there with her expensive lawyer husband and made her feel small and stupid all over again. Karen Richardson strutted into the courtroom like she was walking onto a red carpet at a movie premiere. Her designer suit probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension check. Her hair was freshly styled, her makeup professionally applied, her jewelry tasteful but expensive enough to signal wealth and status. She carried a leather portfolio that she clutched with the confidence of someone who had all the answers, all the documentation, all the justifications for why she deserved to keep that $8,000. She even smiled at the cameras, gave a little wave to the audience like she was the star of the show rather than the defendant in a fraud case. She had clearly spent time preparing for this moment, probably rehearsing her arguments in front of a mirror, maybe even getting coaching from her attorney husband about how to handle aggressive questioning. What Karen had failed to prepare for was the possibility that Judge Judy had done her own preparation, her own investigation, her own deep dive into Karen Richardson's pattern of predatory behavior. Judge Judy sat at her bench reviewing the case file one final time before the cameras started rolling. She had been presiding over cases for over 25 years, first in family court in Manhattan and then on television, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot con artists within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. The moment she had read Margaret Chen's application, something had triggered her instincts. The story was too familiar, the pattern too recognizable. A vulnerable elderly person, a smooth-talking consultant, vague promises, an expensive fee, and then nothing but excuses and disappearances. Judge Judy had seen variations of this scam dozens of times, but something about Karen Richardson's case felt different, more calculated, more systematic. She had instructed her producers to dig deeper, to search for other complaints, to look for patterns. What they found had made Judge Judy's blood boil with the kind of righteous anger that made her famous. The producers had discovered 11 other elderly victims scattered across 3 counties, all telling virtually identical stories about Karen Richardson's consulting business. An unexpected home emergency, Karen showing up with promises to help, an $8,000 fee, fake documents and empty promises, and then ghosting when victims started asking questions. The victims had never connected with each other, never realized they were part of a larger pattern of fraud. Karen had been careful to space out her cons, to target isolated seniors who wouldn't compare notes. But once the producers started making calls, once they started putting the pieces together, the scope of Karen Richardson's operation became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a failed business. This was systematic, calculated, predatory fraud targeting the most vulnerable members of society. And Judge Judy was about to make sure Karen Richardson's career as a con artist ended in the most public, most humiliating way possible. The cameras started rolling and Judge Judy opened the case with her signature no-nonsense approach, her voice cutting through the courtroom with surgical precision. Ms. Richardson, you're being sued by Margaret Chen for $8,000. She claims you took her money, promised to help with her roof repairs and insurance claim, and then provided absolutely nothing in return. Tell me what happened. It was a simple, direct question, the kind Judge Judy had asked thousands of times before. But Karen's response immediately revealed exactly what kind of defendant Judge Judy was dealing with. Karen didn't just answer the question. She launched into a performance that would have made theater directors cringe with its obvious fakeness and transparent manipulation. Your Honor, I run a legitimate senior consulting business that helps elderly homeowners navigate the complex and often confusing world of home repairs and insurance claims. Mrs. Chen hired me to provide professional services, and I did exactly what our contract specified. The words sounded professional enough, carefully rehearsed and delivered with practiced confidence. But then Karen made her first critical mistake. Instead of sticking to facts and evidence, she started editorializing about Margaret's character and competence. She rolled her eyes slightly when describing how Margaret kept calling with questions, her tone dripping with condescension as she explained that some elderly clients simply don't understand how long these processes take. She used phrases like, confused, and didn't comprehend the paperwork, and kept changing what she wanted, to paint Margaret as the problem rather than the victim. Judge Judy's eyebrows raised slightly, that subtle warning sign that experienced viewers knew meant trouble was brewing beneath her controlled exterior. Ms. Richardson, she interrupted, her tone still professional but with an edge sharp enough to cut through steel, I didn't ask for your analysis of Mrs. Chen's mental capacity. I asked what services you provided in exchange for $8,000. The question was direct and devastating in its simplicity, cutting through all of Karen's verbal camouflage to expose the core issue. But Karen, blinded by years of successfully talking her way out of accountability, completely missed the warning. She actually let out an exaggerated sigh, the kind of dismissive sound you make when dealing with someone you consider intellectually inferior, and said, well, if you'll let me finish explaining the context, Your Honor, you'll understand why this situation is more complicated than it appears. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. Judge Judy had been doing this long enough that very few things genuinely surprised her anymore, but the sheer audacity of Karen Richardson sighing at her in frustration, treating her like an incompetent obstacle rather than a federal judge, was something else entirely. Judge Judy leaned forward in her chair, her famous steely gaze locking onto Karen like a heat-seeking missile that had just acquired its target. Excuse me, she said, her voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that made seasoned attorneys break out in cold sweats and career criminals reconsider their life choices. Did you just sigh at me in my courtroom? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, ready to fall and sever whatever remained of Karen's false confidence. Any reasonable person would have recognized this as the moment to back down, to apologize, to show some semblance of respect for the authority they were addressing. But Karen Richardson was not a reasonable person. She had spent so many years manipulating customer service workers and intimidating vulnerable elderly people that she genuinely believed she could use the same tactics on Judge Judy Scanlon. Karen actually smiled, not a nervous smile or an apologetic smile, but a condescending smirk that screamed her belief that she was smarter than everyone else in the room. She turned slightly toward the audience as if preparing to share an inside joke about how unreasonable this judge was being, how she simply didn't understand the complexities of the consulting business. Judge Judy's response was swift and surgical, delivered with the precision of a master surgeon removing a cancerous tumor. Ms. Richardson, let me save us all some time here. Based on the evidence you've presented, or should I say the complete lack of evidence you've presented, and based on your attitude in my courtroom, I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You owe Mrs. Chen $8,000 plus court costs. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with the finality of a guillotine blade, and for most people, that would have been the end of it. Accept the loss, learn the lesson, walk out with whatever dignity remains. But Karen Richardson's arrogance was so deeply ingrained, her belief in her own invincibility so complete, that she did something absolutely unprecedented in Judge Judy's courtroom. She exploded. Her face went through a transformation that would have impressed a chameleon, cycling from shock white to anger red to indignant purple in the span of about 3 seconds. She shot up from her chair so fast it nearly toppled backward, her leather portfolio spilling papers across the courtroom floor like confetti at the world's worst celebration. Are you kidding me right now? Karen shrieked, her voice climbing to decibels that could shatter wine glasses and make dogs howl 3 blocks away. This is absolutely ridiculous. You clearly don't understand basic contract law or how consulting businesses operate. I have documentation. I have precedents. You can't just ignore the evidence because you don't like my tone." The audience gasped audibly, a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind rushing through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had seen everything in his years of service, took an involuntary step forward, unsure whether Karen was about to do something that required physical intervention. Nobody, and this cannot be emphasized enough, absolutely nobody had ever had the suicidal level of stupidity required to tell Judge Judy Scanlon that she didn't understand the law. But Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started on what would become the most spectacular courtroom meltdown ever captured on camera, a performance so breathtakingly arrogant that it would be studied in law schools and psychology classes for years to come as an example of what happens when entitlement meets accountability. Karen actually pointed her finger at Judge Judy, wagging it like she was scolding a misbehaving child who had disappointed her. "I did my research, lady. I have case precedents that completely contradict your so-called ruling. You obviously haven't been keeping up with current legal developments in contract law. Maybe if you spent less time on television and more time in actual courtrooms, you'd understand that consulting fees are non-refundable regardless of outcome." The word "lady" echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Karen Richardson had just called Judge Judy Scanlon, a woman who had presided over 20,000 cases and forgotten more law than Karen would ever pretend to know, lady, in a dismissive, condescending tone that suggested Judge Judy was nothing more than a television personality playing dress-up in judicial robes. Then came the moment that would be replayed 30 million times across every social media platform imaginable, the moment that would define Karen Richardson's legacy and cement Judge Judy's legendary status forever. Karen turned to face the camera directly, playing to what she imagined was an audience that would sympathize with her plight, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh or an embarrassed laugh, but a full condescending, entitled, absolutely earth-shatteringly stupid laugh that announced to millions of viewers that she genuinely believed she was smarter than Judge Judy. "This is exactly why I don't watch this show," Karen announced to America like she was delivering a scathing movie review to her book club. She clearly has no idea what she's talking about. I mean, seriously, how hard is it to understand simple contract law and consulting business practices? The silence that followed was the kind of absolute void where sound itself seemed afraid to exist. Judge Judy sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the bench, watching Karen's performance with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a particularly volatile chemical reaction that was about to explode. And then, with the deliberate movement of a hurricane gathering its full strength before making landfall, Judge Judy stood up from her chair. She stood up, something she rarely did, something that signaled to everyone in that courtroom that they were about to witness something unprecedented in television history. Karen's laughter died in her throat as she finally began to realize that she had made a catastrophic mistake. And then Judge Judy spoke the words that would go viral across the internet and destroy Karen Richardson's life forever. "Can't touch you. Oh sweetheart, I'm not going to touch you. But the district attorney's office, the state fraud investigation unit, and the IRS agents I spoke with last night. They're going to do a lot more than touch you." Judge Judy's words landed like bombs in the courtroom, each syllable detonating Karen's confidence with surgical precision. The transformation on Karen's face was instantaneous and complete. The smirk vanished as if it had never existed. The color drained from her cheeks like someone had opened a valve and let all the blood rush out of her head. Her hands, which had been gesturing so confidently just seconds before, began to tremble uncontrollably. "Wait," she stammered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "What? What do you mean?" Judge Judy wasn't finished. Not even close. She had been building to this moment, and now that Karen had given her the perfect setup with that idiotic, "you can't touch me" line, she was going to deliver a masterclass in judicial destruction that would echo through internet history forever. "And unlike your victims," Judge Judy continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and righteous fury, "they won't be confused by your fake contracts and your attorney husband's threatening letters. They'll be very, very clear about what you are. A con artist who systematically preys on elderly people, stealing their life savings while they're at their most vulnerable." The courtroom was so silent you could hear people's hearts beating. Karen tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, but no words came out. Judge Judy reached down and picked up a thick folder that had been sitting on her bench, a folder that Karen had assumed was just the basic case file. She was about to discover how wrong that assumption was. Ms. Richardson, you thought you were coming here for a simple civil case about one elderly widow who you believed was too confused and too poor to fight back effectively. What you didn't know is that our producers spent the last 3 weeks conducting an investigation that would make professional detectives proud. Judge Judy opened the folder with deliberate slowness, letting the tension build like a conductor leading an orchestra toward its crescendo. We contacted 11 of your previous victims. 11 elderly people scattered across 3 different counties who all told us virtually identical stories about your consulting business. The same promises to help with home repairs and insurance claims. The same $8,000 administration fee. The same fake documents and empty updates. The same ghosting when they started asking difficult questions. Karen's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she grabbed the edge of the defendant's table to steady herself. Her perfectly applied makeup was beginning to run as sweat broke out across her forehead. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, that's not those people, they just didn't understand." Judge Judy's voice cut through Karen's attempted excuse like a blade through butter. "They understood, Ms. Richardson. They understood that you're a predator who has been running the same scam over and over, targeting the most vulnerable members of our society because you believed they were too embarrassed, too confused, and too poor to hold you accountable." The evidence came out piece by piece, each revelation more devastating than the last. Judge Judy showed documents proving that Karen had never filed a single insurance claim on behalf of any of her clients. She presented testimony from contractors who had never heard of Karen Richardson or her consulting business despite Karen claiming to have hired them. She revealed bank records showing that Karen's so-called consulting business had never filed proper tax returns despite taking in over $200,000 in fees from elderly victims. "The IRS is very interested in your unreported income," Judge Judy said with the kind of satisfied tone that comes from knowing justice is finally being served. "They'll be contacting you very soon about your tax obligations for the last 3 years. Karen's attorney husband, who you've used to threaten and silence your victims, he's already been contacted by the State Bar Association. Turns out there are serious ethical violations involved when a licensed attorney uses his position to help his spouse commit fraud and intimidate elderly victims into silence." Karen's breakdown was complete and total. The confident businesswoman who had strutted into the courtroom an hour ago had been replaced by a trembling, sobbing mess who could barely stand upright. "Please," Karen begged, tears now flowing freely down her face and carrying her expensive makeup with them in dark streaks. "Please, Your Honor, I can explain. I made mistakes. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to run a business. I didn't understand, I can pay the money back, please don't, you can't." Judge Judy's expression didn't soften even slightly. "Oh, but I can, Ms. Richardson. And I am." She picked up her gavel, and the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward in anticipation of the final judgment. Margaret Chen is awarded $8,000 plus maximum court costs of $2,500. But that's the least of your problems. I'm submitting this entire testimony, including your admission of running this scheme on multiple victims, to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution. I'm forwarding your case to the State Licensing Board, the IRS, and Adult Protective Services who handle elder abuse cases. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like thunder in the silent courtroom. "You wanted to know if I could touch you." Judge Judy's final words were delivered with the cold satisfaction of someone who had just removed a predator from society. Watch what happens when the justice system actually pays attention to people like you. You're dismissed from my courtroom. Enjoy explaining all of this to those investigators who'll be contacting you very soon. Karen stumbled toward the exit, barely able to walk, her designer heels clicking unevenly on the courtroom floor as she tried to escape the cameras, the audience's hostile stares, and the complete destruction of her carefully constructed life of crime. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause for Margaret Chen, who sat crying tears of relief and vindication. Other elderly victims who had come to watch the case were standing and clapping, finally seeing someone hold Karen Richardson accountable for the pain she had caused so many families. Within 30 minutes of the episode airing, clips of the confrontation started appearing on social media. Within 2 hours, "You Can't Touch Me" was trending on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. By the end of the day, the video had been viewed over 5 million times. By the end of the week, over 30 million people had watched Karen Richardson's spectacular self-destruction, and the number kept climbing. The clip was shared with captions like, "This is what happens when you mess with Judge Judy," and "The moment entitlement died on national television," and "Karen finds out she's not untouchable after all." Legal commentary channels analyzed Judge Judy's coordination with law enforcement, praising her for going beyond just television entertainment to ensure real consequences. Victim advocacy groups used the clip in their awareness campaigns about elder fraud. Psychology professors used it to teach about narcissistic personality disorder and the dangers of unchecked entitlement. The real-world consequences for Karen Richardson came swiftly and mercilessly. Within 72 hours of the episode airing, the district attorney's office filed formal fraud charges against her, citing the television testimony as evidence along with statements from the 11 other victims who had come forward after seeing the show. The IRS initiated a full audit of Karen's finances for the previous 5 years, discovering not just the unreported consulting income but several other financial irregularities that added tax evasion to her growing list of legal problems. Her husband's law firm, facing potential liability and reputational damage, forced him to resign immediately. Within a week, he had filed for divorce, claiming fraudulent misrepresentation during their marriage and seeking to protect his assets from her legal judgments. The bank froze Karen's accounts pending resolution of the fraud cases. She had to sell her house, her cars, and most of her possessions just to pay for legal representation. 8 additional victims came forward after seeing the Judge Judy episode, filing their own lawsuits and providing evidence to prosecutors. The criminal case went to trial 3 months later and lasted just under 3 weeks. The prosecution played the Judge Judy episode in its entirety, using Karen's own words and her courtroom meltdown as evidence of her guilt and lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on 12 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced Karen Richardson to 4 years in state prison and ordered her to pay over $250,000 in restitution to her victims. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, someone in the gallery shouted, "Guess Judge Judy could touch you after all," and the entire courtroom burst into applause. Margaret Chen received her full restitution plus damages, finally able to repair her roof and restore her home. But more importantly, she received validation that she wasn't stupid, wasn't confused, and wasn't wrong to fight back against someone who had tried to steal her dignity along with her money. She became an advocate for elder fraud victims, starting a support group with other people Karen had scammed, and she appeared on several news programs sharing her story to help other seniors recognize and avoid similar scams. The state legislature passed stronger protections for elderly homeowners, requiring licensing and background checks for anyone offering senior consulting services. The new law was informally nicknamed the Karen Richardson Law by the legislators who drafted it, ensuring that her legacy would be one of cautionary tale rather than successful criminal. Judge Judy's handling of the case became legendary in legal circles and among everyday viewers who loved seeing justice delivered with precision and power. The "you can't touch me" moment entered pop culture as shorthand for the moment when arrogant people realize they've finally met someone they can't manipulate, intimidate, or escape from. The case was featured in documentaries about courtroom justice, discussed in law school ethics classes, and analyzed by communication experts studying viral media and public accountability. Karen Richardson thought her wealth, her connections, and her attorney husband made her untouchable. She thought vulnerable seniors were easy targets who wouldn't fight back. She thought Judge Judy's courtroom was just another obstacle she could talk her way through with her polished professionalism and fake legal knowledge. She was catastrophically wrong on every single count. Smash that like button right now if you believe Judge Judy delivered exactly the justice that Karen Richardson desperately needed and that Margaret Chen absolutely deserved. Comment, "Justice served," if you think every scammer who preys on vulnerable elderly people should face this level of public accountability and real consequences. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we're bringing you more incredible stories of entitled people discovering that arrogance always comes with a price and that karma has perfect timing. Share this video with anyone who needs to see that bullies and con artists don't always win, that sometimes the system actually works, and that accountability always catches up eventually. Next time, we're covering the case of a fake doctor who thought she could fool Judge Judy with forged medical credentials. The moment Judge Judy revealed she'd already contacted the state medical board. Pure courtroom gold that you absolutely won't want to miss. Remember, real justice isn't about having the loudest voice or the most expensive lawyer. It's about truth, evidence, and holding people accountable for the harm they cause to others. Karen Richardson learned that lesson in the most public, most humiliating way possible, and 30 million people watched it happen in real time.